The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel ballroom were bright enough to cause a migraine, casting sharp, fractured light across 500 of Manhattan's most ruthless corporate climbers. I sat at the center VIP table, swirling a flute of vintage Dom Perignon, watching the woman in the silver backless gown command the stage. My wife, Chloe Vance, CEO of Vance Media. She had her hand draped casually over the forearm of a younger, sharper-looking man with slicked back hair and a smile that reeked of expensive dental work. Everyone, if I could have your attention, Chloe's voice echoed through the high-end sound system, smooth and dripping with absolute authority. I am thrilled to officially introduce Ethan Cross as our new Chief Marketing Officer. Moving forward, Ethan will not only head our East Coast expansion, but he will also be my closest strategic partner in taking this company to the next level. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. The middle managers, the VPs, the tech leads, they were all clapping like trained seals. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the cold liquid cut through the stifling heat of the room. My personal assistant, Marcus, leaned down over my shoulder, his voice a hurried, panicked whisper that barely carried over the noise of the crowd. "Mr. Wolf, sir, I just got the real-time seat tracking from security. Chloe didn't check the background on the proxy voters. The institutional investors sitting at tables 1 through 4, they aren't answering to Vanguard anymore. They're all your people, sir. Every single one of them." I placed my champagne flute back onto the marble tabletop. The glass made a sharp, distinct clink that felt entirely too loud. On stage, Chloe's eyes scanned the room, eventually locking onto me. Her gaze lingered for half a second, a flash of cold defiance in her eyes. She was waiting for a reaction. For 3 years, she had expected me to play the quiet, accommodating husband who stayed in the shadows while she built her empire on the foundation of my capital. I raised my glass toward her from across the room, offering a polite, effortless nod, a silent toast to her big moment. Chloe's expression shifted, a subtle tightening around her jaw. Shushan shifted her gaze, muttered something to Ethan, who chuckled, casting a patronizing glance in my direction. They stepped off the stage together, moving through the crowd like the undisputed king and queen of Manhattan tech. Within minutes, they made their way over to the head table. Chloe didn't introduce Ethan to me. She didn't have to. "Sebastian," Chloe said, her tone clipped, treating me more like an underperforming regional manager than her spouse. "I notice you didn't look very enthusiastic during the announcement. Don't tell me our East Coast strategy is too aggressive for your blood." "Not at all, Chloe," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my leather chair. "I think it's exactly what you deserve." Ethan stepped forward, extending a hand that sported a brand new Rolex Submariner. "Sebastian, right? The silent partner. Chloe's mentioned you occasionally. Don't worry, man. I know change can be scary for the older guard, but I've got the marketing side completely handled. You can keep doing whatever it is you do in the background." I didn't take his hand. I just looked at the watch. "Nice piece, Ethan. Company expense?" Ethan's smile stiffened. Chloe quickly stepped between us, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Sebastian, stop being petty. Ethan is the future of this firm. If you can't handle seeing someone else take the reins of the growth strategy, you should have stayed home." She leaned closer, dropping her voice so only I could hear. "Honestly, Sebastian, you're acting like a spineless coward. Sitting there, smiling while I bring real talent into this room. You've become dead weight." I chuckled quietly, taking a sip of water. Dead weight. Right. Behind Chloe, her executive assistant, Sarah, was staring at her tablet. Her face had gone completely pale. She stepped up to Chloe, her hands visibly trembling as she held the device. "Chloe," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with terror. "Chloe, you need to look at this right now." "Not now, Sarah," Chloe snapped without turning around. "I'm dealing with my husband." "Boss, please," Sarah urged, her voice shaking so badly it caught Ethan's attention. The emergency proxy filing for the upcoming board meeting next Friday just cleared the SEC. The anonymous hedge fund that bought out the legacy shares? It's not a blind trust. Look at the beneficial ownership disclosure. Chloe frowned, snatched the tablet from Sarah's hand, and scrolled through the document. I watched her face. The corporate confidence drained from her features in real time, leaving her skin a dull, chalky white. Her eyes darted from the screen to me, then back to the screen. This has to be a clerical error," Chloe muttered, her breath hitching. Wolf Holdings? Sebastian, what is this? Marcus chose that exact moment to step up beside me, straightening his cuffs. He looked directly at Chloe, his voice entirely devoid of the fear Sarah had shown. It's no error, Ms. Vance, Marcus said calmly. Mr. Wolf didn't just attend the gala to drink your champagne. He owns the room. Every major stakeholder sitting under these lights answers directly to him. If I were you, I'd be very careful about who you call a coward before the market opens on Monday. Ethan looked back and forth between us, his smug demeanor finally cracking. Chloe? What's he talking about? Who is this guy? I stood up, buttoning my Tom Ford suit jacket. I didn't look at Ethan. I kept my eyes locked on my wife, whose hand was now trembling against her silver dress. Enjoy the rest of your party, Chloe, I said softly, stepping past her. We have a lot to talk about at the office tomorrow. By 8 a.m. the following morning, the executive floor of Vance Media was completely dead. The usual morning chatter near the espresso machine had been replaced by a quiet, nervous tension. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened at the Plaza Hotel, but everyone was staring at their screens, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I walked into my office, tossed my briefcase onto the leather chair, and didn't even bother sitting down. Marcus was already there, holding a tablet and a fresh cup of black coffee. Good morning, Mr. Wolf, Marcus said, his voice clipped and efficient. The legal team finalized the restriction orders on the capital allocation channels at midnight. If Chloe tries to move a single dollar out of the reserve accounts today, it triggers an automatic compliance freeze. Good, I said, taking a sip of the coffee. Where is our brilliant new CMO? He's been locked in Chloe's office since 7. According to our internal auditing tracker, Ethan just submitted an expense authorization for a luxury corporate apartment overlooking Central Park. 3-year lease, $30,000 a month. Chloe already digitally signed the approval. I let out a short laugh. 30 grand a month on a company that hasn't cleared its Q3 debt yields yet. She's losing her mind. Let's go see how they plan to spend my money. I walked down the hall and pushed open the double glass doors to Chloe's office without knocking. Chloe was pacing behind her desk, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight, stressed bun. Ethan was lounging on her Italian leather sofa, looking entirely too comfortable, scrolling through his phone. Sebastian, Chloe said, stopping in her tracks. Her voice was defensive, hardened by a night of zero sleep. You have a habit of walking into my space without permission lately. It's a habit you'll have to get used to, I replied, pulling up a chair opposite her desk. We need to discuss the equity incentive draft you slipped into the board packet for next week. You're trying to hand Ethan 3% of the company's total treasury stock before he's even cleared his 90-day onboarding period. Ethan tossed his phone onto the couch and stood up, adjusting his tie with a smirk. Look, Sebastian, let's be real here. That 3% is part of my signing incentive. I'm bringing Apex Capital to the table for our Series B, $80 million in liquidity. That 3% is a drop in the bucket compared to what I'm delivering. Apex Capital hasn't signed anything, Ethan, I noted dryly. They will next Friday, Chloe interrupted, slamming her palms onto her desk. And frankly, Sebastian, it's not your call to make. You might have snuck around and acquired a block of our legacy shares through some shady shell company, but I still command the majority of the operational board. The expansion plan is going through, and Ethan is getting his equity. I looked at her, seeing the sheer desperation buried beneath her fierce corporate facade. Chloe, we've been married for 3 years. For 3 years, I let you tell the world you were a self-made tech prodigy while my capital covered your payroll deficits. I agreed to the hidden marriage because you said you needed to establish your own authority. But now you're using my company as a playground for your flunkies. Don't talk down to me. Chloe hissed, her eyes blazing. I built the brand. I did the press tours. I am the face of Vance Media. You're just a glorified accountant with a trust fund. If you think you can use a few shares to scare me into dumping Ethan, you're deeply mistaken. Ethan walked over, leaning over the back of Chloe's chair in a blatant display of possession. Listen to your wife, man. You had your run, but the big boys are playing now. If you keep pushing this, we'll have the board vote to dilute your shares into irrelevance by next quarter. Don't play a game you can't afford to lose, Sebastian. I stood up slowly, looking at the two of them. The level of ignorance was almost tragic. They truly believed that a flashy title and a few press releases could override the brutal realities of Wall Street. You think Apex Capital is your savior, Chloe? I asked softly. Apex is a Tier 1 fund, Chloe said proudly. Their managing partner, Harrison Vance, who happens to be a distant cousin of mine, flew in from London personally to close this deal. They don't care about your little domestic disputes. Excellent, I said, checking my watch. Then I suppose we have nothing left to talk about until the board meeting on Friday afternoon. Enjoy your new apartment, Ethan. Make sure you keep the receipts. You're going to need them. Turning on my heel, I walked out of the office, ignoring Chloe shouting my name behind me. Once out in the hallway, I looked at Marcus, who was waiting with his tablet ready. Call Harrison Vance at Apex Capital, I commanded, my voice dropping all pretense of politeness. Tell him his funding authorization for Vance Media is officially revoked. And tell him if he breathes a word of this to Chloe before Friday, I'll liquidate my entire position in his European fund by Monday morning. Marcus grinned. Right away, Mr. Wolf. I walked back to my office, feeling the gears of the trap grinding into place. 10 minutes later, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was an unlisted number. I picked it up. Sebastian, a smooth, British-accented voice said. It was Harrison Vance. He sounded like he was sweating through his bespoke shirt. I just received a very alarming message from your assistant. It shouldn't be alarming, Harrison. It's a direct order, I said, leaning back against my desk. Your fund relies on Wolf Global for 40% of its capital allocation. If you sign that Series B next Friday, you're funding a company that is currently being bled dry by a con man. Chloe told me the expansion was fully vetted, Harrison said quickly. She said you were a non-voting entity. Chloe doesn't know who owns the bank that cleared her last 3 payrolls, I replied coldly. You have your instructions, Harrison. Play your part, show up to the meeting on Friday, and keep your mouth shut until I give the word. Understood, Mr. Wolf, Harrison sighed. We will follow your lead. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. Down in the courtyard, Ethan was getting into an Uber, laughing loudly into his phone, looking like he owned the city. He had no idea he was already a dead man walking. At 2 p.m., Chloe's secretary knocked on my door. She looked terrified. Mr. Wolf? Chloe wants to see you in the main conference room. The regional managers are on the line, and she wants to finalize the East Coast payroll shift. Tell her I'm busy, Sarah, I said without looking up from my screen. She said it wasn't optional. Sir, Sarah whispered, her hands shaking. She said if you didn't show up, she'd have security remove your personal files from the building. I looked at Marcus, who was standing by the door. We both shared a brief, silent smile. All right, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. Let's go watch her dig the hole a little deeper. When I walked into the conference room, Chloe was already at the head of the table, flanked by Ethan and the VP of Human Resources, a spineless guy named Collins. The wall-mounted monitors showed the faces of 6 regional directors from across the country, all looking incredibly uncomfortable. Thank you for joining us, Sebastian, Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sarcasm. We were just discussing the restructuring of the executive compensation pool. Since you refused to sign the equity incentive for Ethan, we're moving the vote to an emergency operational session right now. You don't have the legal authority to shift equity pools during a regional alignment call, Chloe, I said, sitting at the far end of the table and crossing my legs. I have the majority vote of the executive committee, Chloe snapped, leaning forward. Collins, read the bylaws. Collins coughed into his hand, refusing to look me in the eye. Section 4, Paragraph B states that the CEO can override a minority shareholder objection if the funding source is tied directly to an active capital injection. And the capital injection is Apex, Ethan chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. $80 million, Sebastian. I've already got the wire instructions drawn up. If you keep blocking this, you're actively sabotaging the company's fiduciary duties. We can sue you for every dime you have. I didn't look at Ethan. I kept my eyes locked on my wife. Chloe, you really want to do this? You want to bind yourself to a guy who hasn't even shown a single verified acquisition report since he walked through the door? Ethan has a track record from Stanford and London, Sebastian. Chloe shouted, losing her temper in front of the regional managers on the screen. He's doing things you never had the guts to do. You wanted to play it safe, keep the company small, keep me dependent on your little loans. Well, those days are over. On Friday, Apex steps in, and your opinion won't matter anymore. Fine, I said, standing up and smoothing down my jacket. Run your vote. Pass your resolution. But remember this conversation on Friday afternoon, Chloe. Because when the roof caves in, don't say I didn't give you a chance to step away from the edge. I walked out of the room before she could respond, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind me. Marcus fell into step beside me as I headed toward the elevator. Sir, the legal team just confirmed. Ethan's corporate apartment lease was processed using a forged digital signature key from the secondary treasury account. He didn't just spend $30,000. He wired an additional $200,000 as a security deposit to an offshore holding company. He's getting greedy, I said as the elevator doors opened. He knows the clock is ticking. Let him run. By Friday, he won't be looking at a luxury apartment. He'll be looking at a cell. Friday afternoon arrived with the oppressive weight of a summer storm. The main boardroom of Vance Media, situated on the 45th floor with a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline, was filled with the city's top institutional investors. Chloe sat at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating an aura of absolute control. Ethan sat to her right, wearing a bespoke gray suit, looking like a man who had already won the lottery. I sat near the middle of the table, entirely unbothered, typing a casual text to my mother on my phone. All right, everyone, let's bring this meeting to order, Chloe announced, tapping her pen against her tablet. Today we are voting on two critical items. First, the ratification of our new CMO's equity incentive package. Second, the official approval of our $80 million Series B financing agreement with Apex Capital. An older board member, Arthur Pendleton, raised his hand. Chloe, before we vote on the funding, I have a question regarding our short-term liabilities. If we launch the East Coast offices next month, we have a $30 million capital deficit before the Apex funds actually clear our accounts. How are we covering that? Chloe smiled smoothly, a well-rehearsed corporate response ready. We've already secured a bridge loan facility with Imperial Bank at a 5.8% interest rate. It's a temporary measure. Once the Apex capital lands, we clear the debt immediately. 5.8% is too high. I intervened, not looking up from my phone. It's an unnecessary risk that compromises our cash flow margins. Ethan let out a loud, mocking scoff that echoed through the room. Sebastian, please. This is a billion-dollar growth trajectory. If you're scared of a little interest, maybe you belong in a retail bank managing checking accounts. This is how real business is done. A few of the younger board members chuckled nervously. Chloe looked at me with a mix of pity and contempt. Sebastian, your objection is noted, but it's irrelevant. We have a quorum here. Let's move straight to the vote on Ethan's 3% equity allocation. All in favor? Chloe raised her hand. Ethan raised his. For other board members, who had been bought off with promises of future promotions, quickly joined them. The motion carries, Chloe said triumphantly, looking directly at me. The equity is approved. I object, I said, finally putting my phone face down on the table. And I am exercising my right of absolute veto as the primary holder of Class A voting shares. Chloe laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Your veto? Sebastian, you own 25% through your little shell company. My family trust controls 35%, and the independent board members hold the rest. You don't have enough weight to force an absolute veto. Your Class A shares are standard stock. Are they? I asked, tilting my head. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Two men in dark, tailored suits walked in, followed by an elderly gentleman with silver hair who carried an air of immense wealth. It was Charles Wolfe, my father, the patriarch of Wolfe Industries, one of the most powerful private conglomerates in North America. The entire boardroom went dead silent. Arthur Pendleton practically fell out of his chair, trying to stand up out of respect. Charles, Chloe stammered, her voice losing its edge completely. Mr. Wolfe? What are you doing here? Vance Media isn't a subsidiary of Wolfe Industries. Charles didn't look at her. He walked straight to the empty chair at the very end of the table, his attorneys flanking him. He sat down, adjusted his spectacles, and looked at Chloe with absolute indifference. It isn't a subsidiary yet, Mrs. Vance, Charles said, his voice deep and gravelly. Kaiwan Shauna, are you kidding me? Given that my son's personal holdings, combined with the institutional shares my firm quietly acquired over the last 72 hours, now total 52% of this company's outstanding equity, I suggest you change your tone. Chloe's jaw dropped. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a horror that surpassed even her reaction at the gala. "You're your father? Sebastian, you're a wolf? You never asked about my family, Chloe," I said smoothly, leaning forward. "For 3 years, you were too busy telling me how lucky I was to be married to a Vance. You never stopped to look at the name on the bank drafts that kept your company alive." Ethan's face had gone entirely green. He tried to stand up, his voice cracking. "Wait, hold on. This is a hostile takeover. It's illegal. We have an exclusive contract with Apex Capital. Harrison Vance won't allow this." Charles Wolfe let out a dry, amused chuckle. "Young man, Harrison Vance works for me. Apex Capital is a subsidiary of Wolfe Global Wealth Management. I called Harrison yesterday morning. Your Series B funding has been permanently killed." Chloe leaned heavily against her table, her eyes darting frantically between my father and me. "Sebastian, you lied to me. For 3 years, you sat in my house, ate my food, and watched me struggle to keep this company afloat while you were sitting on an empire?" "I didn't lie about anything, Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through her panic with razor sharpness. "I gave you my name, Sebastian Wolfe. You just chose to ignore the last part because you thought I was a nobody. I didn't hide my money from you. I used it to guarantee Vance Media's loans when the banks were ready to shut you down. You didn't care where the money came from, as long as it kept your name in the headlines." Ethan tried to interject, stepping toward my father with a desperate, shaky hand extended. "Mr. Wolfe, sir, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm the one who structured the Apex deal. We can still work together. I can rewrite the terms to favor Wolfe Industries. We don't have to kill the expansion." My father didn't even look at his extended hand. He simply opened a leather folder brought by his attorney and tapped the first page. "Mr. Cross," my father said coldly, "I don't do business with small-time thieves. And I certainly don't renegotiate with men who use corporate assets as personal checking accounts. Your contract with this firm is void. Your presence in this room is a liability." "Chloe, talk to him," Ethan yelled, turning to my wife. "Tell him we have a binding agreement. You signed the operational override." Chloe didn't answer him. She couldn't. She was staring at me, her hands flat on the mahogany table, trying to find her breath. "Sebastian, please. Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you didn't just tank the $80 million deal. The Apex deal was dead the minute you brought a criminal into my boardroom." "Chloe," I said, standing up and leaning over the table. "And now, we're going to talk about what else your brilliant new CMO has been doing behind your back." The boardroom dissolved into absolute chaos. The independent board members were muttering frantically among themselves, looking at Chloe like she was radioactive. "Killed?" Chloe whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched the edge of the mahogany table. "The funding is gone? But the contractors, the leases, we've already committed $30 million to the expansion. Then I suggest you figure out how to pay for it out of your own pocket, Chloe," I said, walking toward the front of the room. "Because Vance Media's corporate accounts are officially locked." Ethan was panicked now, his chest heaving as he pointed a finger at me. "You can't do this. You're destroying the company out of spite because you're jealous of me. Chloe, do something. Call the police. This is corporate sabotage." "Actually, Ethan, speaking of the police," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out a sleek black flash drive. I tossed it onto the center of the table, where it slid across the polished wood, stopping right in front of Chloe. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That's a full forensic audit of our administrative expenses over the last 2 weeks," I explained, looking down at Ethan, whose eyes were darting toward the exit. "It turns out our brilliant new CMO didn't just sign a lease on a $30,000 luxury apartment. He also used the digital signature authorization you blindly gave him last week to wire $20 million of our operational reserves into a private shell company registered in Singapore." Chloe froze. She slowly turned her head to look at Ethan. "Ethan, what did you do?" "He's lying," Ethan screamed, his voice reaching a frantic, high-pitched register. "It was a legitimate offshore marketing retainer. It was for the expansion. Chloe, you have to believe me. Singapore doesn't have an extradition treaty for standard financial disputes, Ethan. You thought you were being clever," I said, leaning against the edge of the table. "You thought you'd use Chloe's blind infatuation with your pedigree to drain the company's treasury and catch a flight to Asia over the weekend. The only problem is the receiving bank in Singapore is owned by Wolfe Group. We flagged the transfer the second it hit the system. The funds have been seized, and your authorization has been flagged as grand larceny. Right on cue, the boardroom doors opened again. This time, 3 plainclothes detectives from the NYPD white-collar crime unit stepped inside. Ethan Cross, the lead detective asked, eyeing the room before locking onto the sweaty, trembling man in the gray suit. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. Step away from the table, please. Chloe, help me. It's a setup. Ethan shrieked as the detectives slammed him against the glass wall of the boardroom, clicking handcuffs around his wrists. He looked entirely pathetic, his slicked back hair falling out of place, tears streaming down his face as he was dragged out of the room, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the floor. The room fell into a deathly silence once the doors clicked shut behind them. Chloe sat paralyzed, her face completely hollow. The independent board members didn't even look at her. They were all staring at me, waiting to see what the new majority owner of Vance Media was going to do next. I looked at Arthur Pendleton. Arthur, clear the room. The board meeting is adjourned. I need to speak with the former CEO alone. Within 30 seconds, the boardroom was entirely empty, leaving only Chloe and me under the cold glow of the recessed lighting. Chloe looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot. You let me walk right into a brick wall, Sebastian. You knew about the wire transfer. You knew about his record. Why didn't you stop it before it got to this? I tried to talk to you about the equity incentive pool last Tuesday, Chloe, I replied, crossing my arms. You told me to stop being petty. You told me I was dead weight. You wanted the golden boy from Stanford because he made your ego feel good. Well, this is what happens when you hire a pedigree instead of a partner. I was trying to scale the business. She yelled, slamming her fist onto the table. I didn't know he was a thief. I trusted him because Harrison vouched for him. Harrison vouched for him because Ethan's father is a major LP in Harrison's European fund, I said, walking over to her chair. It was an inside job, Chloe. They were going to use Vance Media as a cash cow, dump the debt onto your family trust, and leave you holding the bag while they took the technology assets to London. Chloe put her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The 20 million. If those funds are frozen in Singapore, how do we clear our short-term liabilities by Monday? The banks are going to call our bridge loans. We're completely illiquid. You are illiquid, I corrected her softly. Wolf Holdings is perfectly fine. But I'm not bailouting Vance Media as long as your name is on the marquee, Chloe. This company belongs to me now. She looked up, her expression a mix of horror and sudden realization. You didn't just want to get rid of Ethan. You wanted to take the whole company from me. 3 years of marriage, Sebastian. 3 years of sharing a bed, and you've been planning my execution the entire time. No, I said, looking down at her with total detachment. I planned your rescue for 2.5 years. I only planned your execution when I realized you'd rather destroy this company with a con man than admit your husband built the foundation you were standing on. Get your things, Chloe. We're done here. By Sunday evening, the media fallout had turned into a full-blown execution. Every major financial outlet on Wall Street was running the story of Vance Media's collapse Series B and the criminal charges against Ethan. The company's valuation was in a free fall, and the vultures were circling. I was sitting in my private study at the Wolf estate when the security team buzzed the front gate. Mr. Wolf, Chloe Vance is at the perimeter, the guard's voice came through the intercom. She doesn't have an appointment, but she refuses to leave. Let her up, I said. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my study pushed open. Chloe walked in, looking completely unrecognizable. The sharp, polished CEO who used to sneer at me from across a boardroom was gone. She looked frayed, her face pale, holding a worn leather designer bag like a shield. Sebastian, she started, her voice tight, trying desperately to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. We need to talk. Personally, not through your attorneys. I told you everything we had to say to each other on Friday. Chloe, I said, not looking up from the restructuring files on my desk. You can't do this to me, she said, stepping closer to the desk, her voice rising. We are husband and wife. 3 years, Sebastian. We shared a home. We shared a life. Okay, I made a mistake with Ethan. I got blinded by the pressure of scaling the business. But you can't just let the company default on Monday morning. My family's entire net worth is tied up in those shares. If the banks seize the assets, my parents lose everything. I finally put the files down and looked at her. Your family's net worth? That's what this is about. No, it's about us. She cried, her hands slamming onto the edge of my desk. Why didn't you just tell me who you were? If I knew your father was Charles Wolfe, if I knew you had that kind of institutional backing, things would have been different. We could have been a power couple. We could have run the city. That's exactly the problem, Chloe, I said softly, leaning back in my chair. If you knew, you would have loved the money, not the man. I gave you 3 years to see me. Just me. And you treated me like a line item expense you wanted to delete. Chloe's face twisted in frustration. You think you're so innocent? You sat there playing the quiet, supportive husband while you were quietly buying up my company's debt through shell funds. You set me up to fail. I didn't set you up to fail, Chloe. I paid your payroll for 36 months. I shot back, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Do you want to know what real corporate sabotage looks like? Let's talk about 3 years ago. Let's talk about why your father suddenly insisted we get married before Vance Media could launch its initial seed round. Chloe blinked, stepping back. What are you talking about? My father introduced us because he thought you were a stable, hardworking guy from a decent background. Your father introduced us because he owed Imperial Bank $15 million on a failed commercial real estate development, I said, pulling a red folder from my drawer and tossing it onto the desk. He discovered I was Charles Wolfe's estranged son. He knew that if he bound his daughter to the Wolfe name, my father would quietly cover the default to protect the family reputation. Your entire career, your entire self-made empire, was funded by a marriage dowry your father begged my family for. Chloe stared at the red folder, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. She shook her head frantically. No, that's a lie. My father wouldn't do that. I built this company with my own blood and sweat. You built it on my family's money while treating me like dirt, I said, standing up and towering over her. You wanted to keep our marriage a secret not to protect your brand, Chloe, but because you couldn't stand the idea of your friends finding out you married a guy you thought was a nobody. And then you brought Ethan in to replace me the second you thought you didn't need my capital anymore. Chloe fell into the armchair across from the desk, her face entirely blank as the reality of her situation finally broke through her denial. The tears started flowing, ruining whatever makeup she had left. Sebastian, please, she whispered, her voice cracking as she looked up at me with absolute desperation. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever you want. I'll step down as CEO. I'll do a joint press conference with you tomorrow morning. We can announce our marriage. I'll tell the world you're the true brain behind the operation. Just please, save my family. Don't let my father go bankrupt. It's too late for a press conference, Chloe, I said, looking down at her without a single ounce of pity. Your father made his bet 3 years ago, and you made yours last week at the Gala. Tomorrow morning, the market opens at 9. I suggest you call your lawyers and tell them to prepare for an absolute surrender. Monday morning brought no mercy. The executive floor of Vance Media was crowded with lawyers, auditors, and forensic accountants, all wearing matching grim expressions. Chloe sat in the main conference room, flanked by her family's personal attorney, a frantic man named Harold Vance, and her visibly shaken father, Richard Vance. I walked in at precisely 8:55 a.m., followed by Marcus and a team of corporate restructuring specialists from Wolfe Holdings. I didn't take a seat. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the three of them. We have 5 minutes before the opening bell, Richard, I said, looking directly at Chloe's father. Let's not waste time. Richard slammed his hand onto the table, his face purple with rage. Sebastian, you ungrateful bastard. I brought you into my family. I gave you my daughter. And you use your father's muscle to stab us in the back? You didn't bring me into your family, Richard. You traded your daughter for a $15 million bailout, I replied, my voice steady and cold. And then you let her treat me like a piece of office furniture for 3 years while you quietly prayed I'd never find out about your fraud. Sebastian, please, Chloe interrupted, her voice hoarse. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed. We're not here to fight about the past. Harold, just show him the proposal. Harold cleared his throat, pushing a thick stack of documents across the table toward Marcus. Mr. Wolfe, we are prepared to offer a voluntary restructuring. Chloe will step down as CEO immediately and assume a non-voting creative consultant role. The Vance Family Trust will retain 20% of the equity, but we will cede all operational control to Wolf Holdings. In exchange, you absorbed the $30 million expansion liability and dropped the secondary civil suits. I didn't even look at the paperwork. No. Harold blinked, his pen freezing midair. No, Mr. Wolf, this is a highly favorable compromise. It protects the brand identity while giving you absolute authority. I don't need your permission to take absolute authority, Harold, I said, leaning forward, resting my palms on the table. At 9 a.m., Imperial Bank is declaring Richard's personal real estate assets in default. At 9:01 a.m., Wolf Global is executing a margin call on the Vance Family Trust's remaining shares, which were used as collateral for the Series B bridge facility Chloe signed last Tuesday. Chloe gasped, turning to her father. Dad, you used the trust as collateral? Richard looked away, his silence confirming everything. By 9:05 a.m., I continued, looking back at Chloe, your family will own exactly 0% of this company. You don't have chips to negotiate with, Harold. You're completely wiped out. You're a monster, Chloe whispered, a single tear cutting through her makeup. You're destroying my family just to punish me for one mistake. This isn't punishment, Chloe. This is capitalism, I said, pulling a single, 3-page document from Marcus's folder and sliding it to her. This is an unconditional surrender. You sign over all remaining equity, waive your severance, and sign the non-disclosure agreement regarding my family's involvement. Do that, and I buy out your father's default from Imperial Bank. He keeps his house. You walk away with your freedom, but nothing else. And if I don't sign? She challenged, her voice trembling with defiance. Then your father goes to federal prison for bank fraud. You file for personal bankruptcy by Friday, and I buy this company out of receivership for pennies on the dollar next Monday anyway, I said, checking my watch. You have 60 seconds. Chloe looked at her attorney. Harold slowly shook his head, his face completely grim. Chloe, you have to sign. He has us completely cornered. There is no legal recourse here. She looked at her father, who was staring down at his hands, entirely defeated. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and absolute awe. You really never loved me, did you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I loved the woman I thought you were when we met, Chloe, I said softly. But that woman died the moment you started believing your own press releases. With trembling hands, Chloe picked up the pen. She flipped to the signature page and signed her name with a sharp, jagged stroke. She tossed the pen onto the table and pushed the papers back to me. Are you satisfied, Mr. Wolf? She spat, the bitterness dripping from every word. I picked up the document, checked the signature, and handed it to Marcus. Perfect, I said. I looked over at Marcus as the clock on the wall struck 9 a.m. Marcus, coordinate with the PR team. Announce the restructuring. Vance Media is officially dead. As of today, the company operates under Wolf Global Media. Right away, Mr. Wolf, Marcus said, unable to hide his grin. I turned back to Chloe and her family, buttoning my suit jacket. You have until noon to clear your personal items from the executive suite, Chloe. After that, security will escort you from the building. Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the ruins of the Vance empire behind me. By Tuesday morning, the gold-plated Vance Media lettering had already been scraped off the glass facade of the lobby. In its place, clean, matte black steel spelled out a new reality, Wolf Global Media. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly renovated CEO office, watching the traffic crawl down Fifth Avenue. The room felt stripped of its previous clutter, no more flashy, vanity press trophies or oversized portraits of Chloe. Marcus walked in, dropping a fresh stack of transition reports onto the desk. The transition went smoother than expected, Mr. Wolf. 92% of the mid-level staff signed their new retention agreements by yesterday's 5 p.m. deadline. They were mostly just relieved their health insurance wasn't going to bounce. And the regional offices? I asked, turning around. The directors from Chicago, Dallas, and LA are already on standby for the 10 a.m. alignment call, Marcus replied, checking his tablet. They aren't asking about Ethan or the Series B anymore. They just want to know what the new budget caps are. Tell them the caps stay exactly where they are until we finish auditing the Q3 overhead, I said, sitting behind the desk. But let them know the payroll funding is fully secured by Wolf Holdings. No more bridge loans. No more cutting corners. Before Marcus could answer, the desk intercom buzzed. Mr. Wolf, There's a woman from the legal department downstairs. She claims she has a personal item that belongs to you, left behind during the office clear-out. I frowned slightly. Send her up. A few minutes later, Sarah, Chloe's former executive assistant, walked into the room. She looked significantly less panicked than she had on Friday, but she still held a small, taped cardboard box with a sense of cautious hesitation. Mr. Wolf, Sarah said, staying near the door. I was supervising the clean-out of the executive suite over the weekend. Chloe left this in the hidden safe behind the display case. The legal team said everything in the safe technically belongs to the company assets now under the surrender terms, but I thought you should see it privately. I nodded to Marcus, who took the box from her and set it on my desk. Thank you, Sarah. Marcus will ensure your transition to the new administrative pool is processed with a salary bump. Sarah's face lit up with relief. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Once she left, I sliced the tape on the box and opened the flaps. Inside wasn't a corporate folder or a stolen ledger. It was a framed photograph from 4 years ago, taken at a small diner in upstate New York, long before Vance Media was even a blueprint. It was a picture of Chloe and me, sharing a plate of cheap fries, both of us laughing so hard the camera was slightly blurred. Behind the frame was a handwritten note in her neat, slanted script. Asterisk to the only man who sees me without the titles. Let's build something real. Asterisk. Marcus caught a glimpse of it and immediately stepped back toward the door. I'll give you a moment, sir. The regional directors can wait 10 minutes. No, they can't, I said, my voice completely flat as I tossed the frame back into the box and shut the flaps. Throw this in the shredder bin on your way out, Marcus. Marcus blinked, surprised by the lack of hesitation. Sir? Chloe kept that memory in a safe because it made her feel sentimental about a version of herself that she chose to kill, I said, looking him dead in the eye. She didn't love the guy in that diner. If she did, she wouldn't have spent the last 3 years trying to hide him from her board. It's just an old echo. Let it go. Marcus nodded slowly, picking up the box. Understood, Mr. Wolf. I'll get the regional directors on the line right now. As the door clicked shut, I pulled up the live trading terminal on my monitor. The ticker for Wolf Global Media flashed green, the stock stabilizing after days of absolute volatility. The empire was mine. The foundation was secure. I adjusted my cuffs, put on my headset, and clicked the line to join the call. Good morning, everyone. Let's talk about the future.